there has been a lot of attention given in the last day or so to these photographs that the Ukrainians have apparently presented, or apparently did present to the OSCE, showing or purporting to show Russian or people who are the same as in the Georgia incursion in 2008, are similar to, or at least one guy in particular, similar to people who have appeared in eastern Ukraine over the course of the last couple of weeks. I'm wondering, the stories, the reports about this, about these photographs, this evidence that I've seen say that the administration endorses or accepts that these are that these are factual. Is that correct?
Well, a range of the photos that the Ukrainians have provided, and to be fair, a number of U.S. officials have tweeted and provided publicly, are from publicly available photos, either in international media or already on Twitter, that show either individuals or signs of a connection with between Russia and some of the armed militants in eastern Ukraine. So that, as you know, has long been what we have believed, and we've made the case publicly about, whether that's the Secretary or the President or others. So these are just further evidence of the connection between Russia and the armed militants.
Well, how confident are you in their veracity or in the strength of the case that these photographs would appear, or that you and the Ukrainians seem to say? Let me start again. I'm having a difficult day here today. How strong is the case, do you think, that these photographs make?
Well, we've stated the case pretty strongly publicly before these photos were out there, before we were talking about them, in terms of our belief that there's a strong connection between Russia and the armed militants that we've seen in eastern Ukraine and Crimea and other places. So this is more just further photographic evidence of that.
Right, but I mean, how certain are you that these photographs show people, or individuals, who have links to Russia, who were involved in Georgia in 2008 and now are involved in Ukraine in 2014?
Well, what we see in the photos that have been, again, in international media, on Twitter, and publicly available, is that there are individuals who visibly appear to be tied to Russia. Right. We've said that publicly a countless number of times. I will let you all draw the conclusions yourself as to whether these are individuals who look similar or not to other events. Right,
but you keep calling it evidence. Do you think that this is evidence that would stand up in a court of law?
I don't think it's a legal. We're not making a court of law case here. We're just showing that this is photographic evidence that indicates the connection we've been talking about for weeks now.
But it doesn't prove. But you think that it is proof of the connection, or it's just or you're just alleging that it's another sign of this?
It's another sign, Matt, of just if you look at these photos.
I'm just, as you know, and you've talked about, and the Russians have talked about as well, this propaganda war that's going on between the two sides. And what we saw last week was Secretary Kerry in Geneva getting up and talking about this leaflet that was put out, which regarding Jewish registration in Donetsk. And it appears that this is just a hoax. This is not a real thing, and yet it was identified as something of major significance by the Secretary and by others. And I'm just wondering, given that and the apparent the fact that what appears to have been a hoax got turned into something very much more major than it had the potential to be. If these photographs could fall, if the Russians could point to these photographs as falling into the same category.
Well, Matt, there's a range of details out there we've talked about that leads us to believe there's a strong connection. We'll let people draw their own conclusions.
Jen, but you're saying you're making a case in this case.
Well, Saeed, I would point you to. Let me finish.
Okay.
I would point you to what the Secretary, what the President, what Susan, and Susan Rice have said, what we've all been saying for weeks about the strong connection. This is not a new argument.
But you're not. Are you saying that the United States government, with its, great tradition of intelligence gathering and sources and so on is now dependent on publicly traded photographs on the internet and Twitter and so on?
I think it's fair for me to convey that we're looking at a fair share of classified and unclassified information. We're discussing both, but these are a range of photos, and you've hit the point on the nail on the head there, that have been publicly available, that are on Twitter, that are in international media, and we'll let you draw your own conclusions.
No, you said something that they appear to be, they look like. Are you saying that you're actually looking at what they look physically, and they look like people who are connected to Russia? Is that what you're suggesting?
Again, Saeed, I think I've answered this question. Do we have...
So you're saying that these photographs back up classified intelligence that
No,
you've
I'm
gotten
not saying
from
that
the-
at all. I'm saying they back up the public argument we've been making for weeks.
Right, but your argument is not just based on the publicly available photographs like these ones, correct?
Obviously, I'm not going to talk about classified information.
Well, I'm just asking you,
but
but do
it
you-
is fair that we are having a range of conversations with our international partners, and these photos which are again publicly available,
Right.
are just further evidence or further examples.
I guess I'm just not sure why you keep pointing out that they're publicly available. I mean, no one's saying they're not, but but just because they're publicly available doesn't. I don't see how that buttresses your argument one way or the other. What I'm asking is whether these publicly available photographs mesh with, back up any indications that you're getting from non-public or intel.
Well, Matt, I'd point you to the public argument we've been making for weeks about.
Would
the
you make
connection.
that public argument if you didn't have other reason to
I'm
believe
not
that
going
it was
to
true?
answer it further.
Well, then I'm not sure. Then you're just.
I think
You have no reason to
consistently, Matt,
believe-
we have consistently made the same argument about the connection between Russia and between these armed militants. That's been consistent for weeks. These photos just show further examples of that connection.
But you wouldn't be making that argument. Am I correct? You wouldn't be making that argument if you didn't have other reasons to suspect that
We
there
feel
were these
confident
links?
in our argument. I'm not going to back it. I'm not going to outline it further.
These photographs and this publicly available evidence does actually support what we have gathered in by other means.
What we've stated for weeks.
Okay.
Do we have any more on this?
I wanted to ask you about the pictures that we talked a lot about yesterday. NBC spoke with the mayor of Slavyansk. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. And he told us that the reason we're seeing military there is not because they're on specific orders from Moscow, but rather he's former military, he called his buddies and to come help the cause. And that's why they're in these eastern towns in Ukraine. And it's, I guess, a different interpretation of the photos than...
Well, there were a range of photos, and not just a range of photos. The Ukrainians presented a range of photos in Vienna just a few weeks ago. There have been a range of photos available in international media, available on Twitter and social media sites that have portrayed a range of events. I think you're talking about one photo. We still feel confident that there is a strong connection between Russia and the armed militants in eastern Ukraine. Across the board, we've seen similar steps or similar behavior we saw in Crimea just a couple of weeks ago. And we're obviously watching what is happening on the ground very closely.
So you're saying this is just one isolated...
I don't have the details of that particular photo in front of me. What I would say is there are hundreds of photos out there of what's happening on the ground. There are hundreds of reports of what's happening on the ground. We look at a range of information, whether it's publicly available information, information through our own sources, to make determinations about what we think is happening. You've heard many others, not just the United States, speak to their beliefs about the strong connection between Russia and the armed militants, and we certainly stand by that.
I guess yesterday, Jen, you said we'll let some people draw their own conclusions. Can you today, with any of the other information that you have that may not be publicly available, say in any stronger terms that Russia is behind these armed
I think
movements.
I've not only been strong, the President of the United States has been strong, the Secretary of State has been strong about the strong connection we feel between, the Vice President has been strong about the strong connection we feel between Russia and the armed militants in eastern Ukraine.